Welcome back to part two of the diseases that affect the nervous system. We are starting up with acute encephalitis. In fact, we're going to talk about multiple kinds of encephalitis. This is just the sudden um, onset of the brain starting to swell, or we call this inflammation of the brain. So this, as you can imagine, is always going to be a pretty serious symptom. So it's where the tissues of the brain start to swell. This can be really bad because, of course, your brain controls just about everything. What we see as far as other symptoms that go hand in hand with this inflammation of the brain is behavioral changes, confusion. This has a tendency to look kind of like dementia, like very sudden onset dementia, decrease in consciousness and seizures. Unfortunately, a lot of the symptoms can vary because the brain is swelling, there is damage to that brain tissue. It can be hard to identify one specific thing, but we can see a lot of things all at once. One of the causes of encephalitis could be from arboviruses. So this is going to be arboviral encephalitis. The causative agent is arthropods that are carrying these arboviruses. So the insects are going to be the vectors carrying that virus. The virus is the microbe type. I know that doesn't say that exclusively on the slide, but that is what I want to get across here. These vectors could be things like mosquitoes, ticks, flies, fleas, even spiders. And it kind of varies what arbovirus we're talking about, but we are going to clump them all together here. I don't need you to remember anyone in particular, although there may be a few on the list of examples that I show you that you don't have to remember, that you recognize. But again, we are going to be talking about several types of viruses here, but we are just smooshing them all together. So arbovirus actually just is kind of a shortened version of saying arthropod-borne viruses. That transmission, like I said before, is vector transmission, where we have some type of insect or arthropod that is feeding on the blood of host and then is infecting other individuals. Where we see the vast majority of arboviruses popping up is usually during that emergence of arthropods, so spring and fall. So think about when like mosquitoes come out and ticks and things like that. It's usually when the weather starts to get a little bit warm and just before we jump into winter. The reservoir is going to be warm-blooded vertebrates that are able to maintain the virus during the colder and dry seasons. All right, remember that with signs and symptoms for encephalitis, it can be extremely varied because we're affecting the brain. The brain is swelling, so we see a lot of different symptoms. So there's kind of a laundry list here of coma, convulsions, paralysis, tremors, loss of coordination, memory deficits, changes in speech and personality, sometimes heart disorders. But essentially, just realize that with encephalitis, the brain controls everything, and there's a lot that can go wrong if the brain starts to swell. So that's what is leading to this wide range of symptoms. Especially with this particular type of nervous system disease. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of treatment that exists for these types of viruses. It's essentially just make the patient comfortable. Prevention is going to be the biggest point of attack that we can have against arboviruses. So lowering the vector populations whether that is treating like mosquito populations or removing breeding grounds for mosquitoes or avoiding areas where you know there are these arboviruses present in those vectors, things like that. That is the biggest kind of point of prevention. Mosquito nets, using bug sprays, things like that. Super important. Just prevention is the biggest way that we can make sure that we don't get these arboviruses, because once you have them, there's not a whole lot we can do. All right, like I said, don't memorize these examples. These are just some examples of these arboviruses that cause that encephalitis. So we have a few, and their reservoirs where we typically find them in the US, as well as they are mostly mosquito vectors, is what you'll notice. And that makes sense. When it comes to mosquitoes, when they bite us, they are also spitting into the bite. So they are transferring some of the blood that they already have inside of them. So if they are carrying that virus, they're going to be spitting those virus particles into our bloodstream when they bite us to suck our blood. So that's how that works. Isn't that fun? Kind of insult to injury that when they bite us, they also spit into the bite. Another acute encephalitis is herpes simplex encephalitis. And essentially what we're saying here is that this herpes simplex could cause encephalitis in some cases. It's more common that it can cause encephalitis in newborns, where the newborns get it from their mothers. But it's less likely to happen in adults that it causes encephalitis, but we will talk about this substantially more when we talk about STDs and STIs. So don't worry, we'll get to this a little bit more a little bit later. One more encephalitis disease, virus actually, is the JC virus. This is going to be a virus that the vast majority of people have actually probably already had. It's just that for the most part, most people do not have symptoms. The reservoir is humans. The microtype is a virus. The causative agent is the JC virus. Transmission is respiratory droplets, direct contact, usually contaminated blood transfusions or vertical transmission, so from mom to fetus. And it's very good at spreading. However, again, typically, most people who have had it, which is the vast majority of people, haven't shown symptoms. Most people are asymptomatic unless you are immunocompromised, which can cause a PML, or a progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, which is essentially just clumsiness, weakness, difficulty speaking, and that's kind of the big thing here, is that this virus ends up eating away at the brain and causes this really sudden, because remember, acute encephalitis means that it's sudden. So it causes this sudden brain damage that can lead to death within a year. And that has everything to do with the brainstem becoming attacked by the virus itself. So for preventions and treatment, unfortunately, there is none. There is a vaccine in the works. Unfortunately, it's just nowhere near human trials as of the moment when I am making this lecture in 2025. But who knows? Maybe in upcoming years that information will change. Hopefully, fingers crossed. All right, moving into subacute encephalitis. So still talking about brain inflammation, but it's not sudden. It takes a while. So there are three typical causes of subacute encephalitis, just like we talked about three causes of acute encephalitis. We're going to talk about three subacute encephalitis. The first subacute encephalitis is toxoplasmosis. This is going to be a microbe type that we haven't seen as much. It is a protozoan. The causative agent is Toxoplasma gondii. The reservoir is mammals, and for me, unfortunately, is primarily in cats. And if you know me, you know I adore cats. I have a handful of cats at the moment, and so this is awful. So either way, let's talk about it. The transmission is the inhalation, ingestion, or possibly through transplacental movement of this protozoan getting into the system. Okay, so this can be inhaled, that protozoan, you can ingest that protozoan, or it can move from mom to fetus if mom is pregnant. So in the US, typically what we see is that almost all cases involve litter boxes. And a lot of it has to do with the litter boxes that are clay litter, drier litter, because that's kind of the goal, is to dry out the feces so that it is easier to scoop and get rid of. Now, this is where things get kind of unfortunate in that once that feces is all dried out and then you go to scoop or you dump the litter box or whatever, and you get this plume essentially of dust and feces and urine, and what's in the feces, that dried feces, is that protozoan, that Toxoplasma gondii. So let's talk a little bit more about toxoplasmosis. Most cases will be asymptomatic or have mild symptoms. A lot of the population have been infected with toxoplasmosis. However, most people are asymptomatic, or they have very mild symptoms like a sore throat or swollen lymph nodes or a low-grade fever, which sounds like just about anything, or maybe like a rough day kind of thing. You just kind of went too hard that day at work, or too hard at the gym. Who knows? Um, Most of the time where we see more of an issue is in individuals who have weakened immune systems. So we see chronic or subacute encephalitis that can lead to brain damage, brain lesions, problems with the heart and lungs. But that is the case where we are concerned. So individuals that are immune compromised, or maybe individuals who are pregnant, that is the big issue. Now, we did already talk a little bit about the transmission, but again, it is kind of just handling litter boxes. So if you are an individual who is immune compromised or pregnant, maybe have someone else handle the litter box for a little bit. Because that parasite can cross into the fetus from the placenta, and cause issues with the fetus, all kinds of things from a stillbirth to a miscarriage to birth defects, all kinds of things. Um, what's a little bit interesting is when we talk about the epidemiology of toxoplasmosis, it is hard to track because cats, as far as any case that we know of, cats are asymptomatic, and we can't detect when a cat has toxoplasmosis based on their behavior because they don't show any signs or symptoms. You would have to be specifically testing a cat for toxoplasmosis to know if they have it. However, when it comes to prey animals like mice and rats, they usually have some type of behavioral change, which is very odd for a protozoan. It causes a behavior change. And this is not the first time, or this is the first time we're talking about a behavior change, but it's not the last. So what this protozoan will do is make mice braver or thrill-seeking. So what happens is the mice or rats will walk up to a cat or an owl or whatever, some type of predator, and just be like, hey, buddy. And of course, the predator, not really realizing, well, that's weird behavior for prey, will eat that animal, eat that mouse or that rat that's acting weird. From there, once inside the digestive tract of that cat, that is where the protozoan is going to reproduce and then be expelled in the feces and move on to the next host, that kind of thing. So it's kind of an interesting life cycle for toxoplasmosis, but there it is, kind of a weird one. Unfortunately, it just affects us not so well if you're immune compromised. And here we see measles popping up again. Unfortunately, just like we're seeing in the US at the moment, it is popping up again. This is going to be a virus that we have seen before where it causes a rash, but one of the side effects can also be that it can cause subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, so that longer term brain inflammation. Sometimes it can take years until you see that particular symptom, but that is what makes measles kind of a real concerning virus, is that it can cause years after being infected with that initial measles episode, encephalitis, so that brain swelling. There is no effective treatment, and it is nearly always fatal if this particular symptom pops up. So kind of a little PSA, if you get the vaccine for measles, you can still get measles. However, you will not develop this particular symptom. You will not die from measles. It will be very mild if you get the vaccine and still contract the virus. It will prevent you from dying from the virus if you get the vaccine. So this is the concern when it comes to measles, is this subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. The third and final subacute encephalitis condition we're going to talk about is prions. You should recognize prions from quite a few chapters ago. These are those nasty infectious proteins that are literally just that. They're just infectious proteins that fold incorrectly and then eat away at your brain. So these are kind of terrifying in the sense that we can't really destroy them. We can't treat them once you're infected, and they eat away at your brain. And once you are infected with these prions, they're kind of like a zombie protein in that once that protein touches one of your healthy proteins, it causes your healthy protein to fold incorrectly or denature and become a prion and start infecting other proteins. So the disease that prions cause is transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So TSE, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, is caused by prions, those infectious proteins. The transmission is going to be ingestion or surgical contamination. So if you're getting brain surgery and somehow these prions are on the surgical tools, then potentially that is going to find its way into your brain as well. But typically what we see is the ingestion of prions leading to the infection of prions. So I know for the most part that in the US, we do not eat usually brain material or brain matter, but in the process of butchering animals to make your ground beef or your steak or whatever, brain bits can still get into those products, and that can spread prions. So essentially just infected brain tissue gets into your packaged meat. So don't look into it too much if you want to keep eating meat. If it doesn't bother you, great, love that for you. The reservoir is humans and animals, and there are different types of TSE diseases. Some you've probably heard of, like sheep scrapie, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, Kuru, something we've talked about before, and then the one you probably know of, probably the most, is mad cow disease. This affects bovines. This had a pretty rampant spreading in the UK, I believe, in 2012-ish. I want to say somewhere around there. You don't have to know that. Just know that we've had a handful of outbreaks of mad cow, and the only thing that we can do when there is an outbreak of something like that is just to kill all the animals that potentially have this TSE. There's nothing we can do about it once that animal has it, and um, we can't put that meat out to market either. There's the risk does not outweigh the reward of having a burger, right? So the only thing we can do, because it is also highly contagious, is to kill those animals and then kind of move on from there. Because there's really not a whole lot we can do. And the only way to test to see if an animal has these prions is to take a brain core sample. And most critters don't really survive that type of sampling. And then there wouldn't be a whole lot we could do afterwards if we found out that they were positive for those prions anyway. So what we typically see with encephalitis, of course, is that altered behavior, memory loss, impaired senses, delirium, maybe something kind of like dementia. And then with humans, what we see is a life expectancy once you start showing symptoms, because there is kind of a difference here. Let me talk about it. Once you start showing symptoms, you have maybe a few months to maybe just a handful of years with palliative care. So just trying to make you comfortable as your brain starts to get eaten away by these infectious proteins. Now, the thing here is you might not show symptoms for years after you've been infected with the prion. However, once you start showing symptoms, then unfortunately it's a steep slope down into showing all these other symptoms, and it will only pick up its pace through the months and years. So it's a very quick decline. So here we can see a normal brain, what we should be seeing, nice and healthy, whereas in those other examples, Kuru, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and Scrapie, we can see those white spaces start to form where the brain is being eaten away by those prions, those infectious proteins. So these are types of that transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So kind of keep that in mind. We don't want holes in our brain. That is not what we want. And that is what these diseases cause. Moving right into rabies. Rabies is a virus. The causative agent is the rhabdovirus. The reservoir is typically animals. So things like canines, skunks, raccoons, cats, and bats. There are a handful of other things that we'll talk about here in just a minute, but those are kind of the primary offenders when it comes to rabies, especially in the US. The transmission is typically an animal bite. However, it could be a scratch or possibly droplet inhalation. Now, for a scratch to transfer that virus, that animal who is infected likely just licked their claws or paws and then scratches, and that is what causes the virus to move from the infected animal to another animal or to a human. Droplet inhalation, which is incredibly rare, would have to be that this animal that has the rabies virus is growling or barking or yowling or whatever right in your face and you're breathing it in. So this is really rare because most people probably would not allow that animal to be right up in their face, um, making that type of noise and racket, that type of thing. So the reason that we see a bite or a scratch that, was just a paw or claw that was licked, um, cause the transmission of this virus is that the virus embeds itself in the brain of this animal and then it moves to the salivary glands. So that is kind of the big thing. The salivary glands are the main point of transmission. That is the big thing here. Now, the signs and symptoms are kind of a little bit odd because of the incubation period, but the incubation period is going to be dependent on the severity of the bite or scratch, as well as the location of that bite or scratch. So let's talk about that. The virus has to travel to the brain of the host. So if the bite or scratch is closer to the brain, then it'll be a shorter incubation period. So if you get bit on the shoulder or the neck, then it's a very short space to travel from that area to the brain, versus if you're bit on the ankle or the thigh, then that is a longer space to travel for that virus. So the incubation period would be probably closer to that, long into the range, roughly 2 months. What we see is muscle spasms of the mouth. So typically what we might interpret as snarling is what we will see with the starting symptoms, as well as hydrophobia that could potentially end in encephalitis. However, the cause of death with rabies is one of those two things, is either dehydration due to hydrophobia or encephalitis, that brain swelling. So let's talk about the first one because we know what encephalitis is. We understand that the brain swelling inside of the skull can cause death because that's brain damage. But hydrophobia, we've never talked about that before. This virus can cause behavioral changes. So this is that second behavioral change I said we would end up discussing. Hydrophobia is a fear of water. Now, because this virus can cause muscle spasms and paralysis in some cases, it just kind of depends, but mainly those muscle spasms, it can lead to an animal drowning if they go swimming across some water or if they even take a drink and kind of like fall in. So, in order for the host not to die, because that's not what the virus wants, the virus wants to be passed on to another host. So it makes their current host afraid of water so that their host doesn't go anywhere near it. That means that we see a lot of infected animals with rabies die of dehydration before they even die of encephalitis, which is kind of interesting. I mean, sad, but interesting. Now, you've probably heard of the book or the movie Cujo. This is about a dog who contracts rabies and goes on a big old killing spree. Super fun, entertaining, if you like that kind of thing. If you don't, then don't watch it. But this is an example of one of the types of rabies that animals can get. That is furious rabies, where animals are restless and highly excitable, irritable. They're more likely to attack, right? Versus paralytic rabies, where animals seem to be unaware of their surroundings. We see this in animals more predominantly that are nocturnal, something like a raccoon. During the daytime, they look like they're just wandering and kind of listless, not really knowing where they are or what they're doing. So again, we can kind of identify furious rabies think of Cujo. Paralytic rabies, think of a raccoon during the daytime that's kind of just wandering around, maybe walking across a street, but like zigzagging in a way. They look really lost. I would define that as being a lost animal. They just have no idea what's going on around them. So because rabies is such kind of an intense virus, there has been a lot of research. In fact, if you remember back to all the important old guys that we talked about in one of the first couple of chapters, we talked about Louis Pasteur, and he actually came up with one of the first vaccines when it came to the rabies virus. But that is not currently what we use, of course. But he was one of the first to look at the rabies virus and find a way to prevent death in humans when it comes to the virus. So we do have preventions and treatments depending on your exposure. So if you deal with animals on a regular basis, there's a good chance you will be encouraged to get the vaccine if you work with animals. So if like you're a pest control type of person or a veterinarian, you probably have gotten the rabies vaccine. However, if you're someone like me who is a teacher, you probably don't work with animals like that, so you wouldn't have a need to get the rabies vaccine. So just essentially high risk groups, people who handle animals. Now, there is a post-exposure treatment where if you've been previously vaccinated, it's only 2 shots. If you've never been vaccinated before, it's 4 shots. However, little caveat here, you need to be treated with this post-exposure treatment if you think you've been exposed to the rabies virus almost immediately. So 48 to 72 hours thereabouts. But I would always err on the side of caution and make it as soon as possible. Because again, depending on where you've been bitten, it's going to move faster or slower, but you should still seek medical attention if you've been bit by something. Because once you start showing symptoms of the virus, and if the virus has moved to your brain already, there's nothing we can do. It's just palliative care. This is kind of a fun picture, shows a few fun things here. That movement of the virus from a bite on the ankle, it needs to move from that bite to your brain. And if that bite is further from the brain, it will take a little while before it can get there. That is that incubation period. The other fun thing about this image is this little critter here that one of the instructors has dubbed a fever dream possum, because can you really tell exactly what it is? It's kind of got the face of a rat, but these long, spindly legs, kind of a cat tail, but a big old badonkadonk. Kind of a silly looking thing, but enjoy it. It kind of shows a lot of fun things here. All right, so in the US, the various creatures of concern when it comes to rabies, we have listed out in everywhere in the US. Typically, except for Hawaii, we are concerned with bats carrying the rabies virus. And then in Missouri, if you're on the Missouri side, skunks. However, if you're in Illinois, pretty much just bats is the big thing. We do have kind of a fun animal that maybe you didn't know we had in the US, and that is a mongoose. They do carry rabies and do have a tendency to be a bit of a concern down southwest. So just some stuff to be aware of, especially if you do a lot of traveling. All right, we have 2 more diseases, and they are both bacteria. They're also kind of related to each other. So the first is tetanus. Tetanus is a bacteria, Clostridium tetani. It is a gram-positive endospore forming, that is the concern, bacteria. The reservoir that we find this particular bacterium is the environment in soil. So maybe you've heard the myth that if you step on a rusty nail, you can get tetanus. However, it is not the rust, it is not the nail itself that gives you the tetanus. It's the dirt that is on the nail, because it's probably a dirty nail if it's rusty, and it's the puncture of the nail pushing that microbe deep into your tissues. So it's not the rust again, it's not the nail. The nail is just a way for the microbe to get deep into our tissues. So the transmission is that direct contact or entering through an open wound or injection, like we were just talking about just then. So the concern is this endospore causing these issues that we're about to talk about. So for our signs and symptoms, the big thing with tetanus is going to be paralysis. However, I need you guys to understand that there are kind of two kinds of paralysis, and we're going to talk about both of them with tetanus and then our next microbe and disease, which is botulism. So that is the other type of paralysis. So let's talk about it. The type of paralysis that we see with tetanus is going to be a spastic paralysis. Very important. This spastic paralysis is going to be like clenching. The muscles contract really hard, very forceful, continual muscle contractions. Spastic paralysis. When you think of paralysis, you probably think of a limp paralysis. This is not that. Botulism will be, tetanus is spastic paralysis, muscle clenching. Now, the concern with this muscle clenching is that while it might begin in the jaws, kind of creating this like clenching of the jaws, kind of a almost again kind of a snarling type of look. You'll see in the next picture, next slide, I have a couple pictures. But we also see the back arching because those back muscles are going to start to contract as well, possibly the arms and legs, as well as the torso muscles will start to contract. However, the big concern here is that the muscles of the back are particularly big and strong. So if there is kind of a tug of war, if you will, between the muscles contracting of the back and the front, your back muscles are bigger and they're going to win. So you start to bow backwards because those muscle contractions are going to be stronger. This concern is that you die from suffocation due to your respiratory muscles becoming contracted, or that contraction of the back muscles causes the neck and back to break. So you'll see again in the next picture, kind of terrifying to see how that can happen. The prevention is a vaccine. Again, typically people who are more likely going to be exposed to tetanus will take this vaccine, but there is treatments that can be given if you catch it in time. So here we have some images of that clenched jaw as well as the back bowing. We have this painting that was thought to be a possession, but what we can see from the way that this person is contracting backwards, as well as their feet are contracting, their arms are contracting, the clenching of the mouth, this is very indicative of the signs and symptoms of tetanus, actually. So very likely this individual who was being painted was not being possessed. They had tetanus. And that moves us into botulism. So also a bacteria, Clostridium botulinum, is going to be found in the soil, just like tetanus. The transmission is ingestion or entering of a wound. So we also have this term intoxication, which is ingestion of the exotoxin without the microbe itself. So we don't actually consume or have the cells of the bacteria entering our body at all, but it's the toxin of the microbe that enters our system. So that is called intoxication. That is also a mode of transmission for this particular disease, botulism. There are three forms of botulism, which is infant botulism, usually associated with feeding infants raw honey, and this microbe or the exotoxin gets into their system and causes paralysis. And again, we talked about how tetanus is that spastic paralysis. With botulism, it's flaccid paralysis. So that limp paralysis that we were talking about before that you typically think of when you think of paralysis, that is what happens here. In infants, we call this floppy baby syndrome. Now it sounds super cute, but it's not. So essentially the baby becomes paralyzed and their limbs and body become kind of floppy. But it's because of this bacteria or the exotoxin that they've consumed because of this raw honey, unpasteurized honey. We can also see botulism with foodborne as well as wound botulism. So getting into our system, either we are consuming it, usually by not cleaning things properly or consuming things that are unpasteurized, or rubbing dirt into a wound or dirt being rubbed into a wound in general, or getting into a wound, that can also cause this botulism to occur. So it used to be pretty common, and now it's kind of coming back around to be kind of common again, to can your own food. However, if anything is not necessarily regulated by the FDA, you could risk consuming this bacteria and then contracting foodborne botulism, which is the most common form of contracting botulism in adults. For kids, it's usually honey, consuming that unpasteurized raw honey. However, kind of a little PSA when it comes to canning food, if you can food with these mason jars, which is a fabulous way to can and store food that you make yourself, just make sure that the center of that metal disc in the middle of the lid doesn't pop. If it pops, then there are gases being produced by microbes, and that means that there are microbes in there. Does it mean that it's this particular type of microbe that causes botulism? Not necessarily, but you probably don't want to eat it because, again, that means that it wasn't canned properly. Stuff is growing inside of the food. You probably don't want to consume it. So prevention is just proper canning. For babies, don't give them raw honey until they're old enough. I don't know what age that necessarily is, but don't give it to a baby. Treatment is supportive care and an antitoxin. But kind of interestingly, guys, we do use the botulism toxin for something that you probably have heard of, and that is microdosing of essentially like skincare, I guess. So getting rid of wrinkles, but you can also use this for like overactive sweat glands. But mostly we think of Botox as being a cosmetic procedure. But this is still one and the same. It is still the botulism toxin that is used to essentially paralyze various parts of your face, I suppose, or maybe your sweat glands, who knows? All kinds of fun stuff. So here are some images of that floppy baby syndrome. We've got little infants that have botulism, again, potentially from consuming unpasteurized honey, that raw honey, and it causes that paralysis in these individuals. Again, sounds cute, but it's not. And then just like that, we have covered all the infectious diseases of the nervous system. Hope you enjoyed it and you're making flashcards of some kind. This is a lot of memorization for this particular exam. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, ask, and I will get back to you. Make good choices and happy studying.